Hi folks, in this video we are introducing some basic concepts of corporate strategy. So it's a little bit longer than some of our other videos, so grab a drink, pause the video, grab yourself some popcorn, and settle back in. So up until this point in this class, even though it's called corporate strategy, what we've been talking about is probably better described as business or competitive strategy. So we've been considering how a firm competes in a single industry to gain and sustain competitive advantage. Corporate strategy, on the other hand, thinks about the diversified business or the multi-industry business. And it focuses on how the scope and organization of a business can create value. So the questions of corporate strategy focus more on which markets should the business compete in. So that's including what range of products or services should we offer and where geographically should we compete. There's some questions around execution too. So that's all fine and dandy to say we should compete in the widget market, but how do we actually enter the widget market? Through an acquisition, through some form of alliance or long-term exchange, or by building a capability in-house. And then finally is the question of organization. How do you organize your business to best compete or capture value? And that's a question we're going to actually reserve for next week mostly, but it is an important one. So the Casadesus reading I assigned for this week approaches corporate strategy through kind of three different lenses. So first is the question of synergy. Are two different businesses that operate in two different industries better off together in some form of long-term exchange, or are they better off transacting on the spot market? The second is the question of ownership. So businesses can enter a long-term exchange that falls short of outright owning, one owning the other, or operating under the same firm. So what conditions need to be met for ownership to be necessary to create value for those two businesses to be combined in one organization? And the last question that Casadesus poses is around organization, which again, we will approach or treat next week. So Casadesus uses this term that may not be familiar to you, which is spot market transaction. And that is just any transaction two parties engage in that has no future obligation to transact again. So I purchased a cup of coffee this morning from a coffee hut. That was a spot market transaction. There are other forms of long-term exchange, which includes most contractual relationships, where two businesses might obligate themselves to work together to produce a good or service, or one might commit to purchasing services from another. So there are a bunch of different contractual arrangements, but that's the most common form of long-term exchange, short of one business acquiring another, or them merging and operating under one roof as one organization. Licensing or franchising arrangements are specific examples of a type of contractual arrangement. A joint venture is one step more stringent than a contractual arrangement, but it's when two businesses remain separate organizations, but they create a third organization of which they have shared ownership. So it is a bit of a more stringent form of integration than a contract. But it's still not quite the same thing as two organizations becoming one single organization. So when Casadesus talks about synergy, he's just talking about whether or not a positive value is created by two organizations entering some form of long-term exchange. I want to bring us back to this chart, which actually I think I showed you guys a couple weeks ago when we were talking about Jimawat and the idea of competitive advantage. So when we were talking about Jimawat and how does a firm gain and sustain competitive advantage, we talked about driving a wedge between customer willingness to pay and the cost to produce a good or service. Casadeisus replaces this idea of cost to produce with this concept of supplier opportunity cost, which is basically your supplier's next best alternative as opposed to selling their product or service to you. So why does he do that? Well, when we talk about the value created, there is the value that's created and captured by a customer, which is the difference between their willingness to pay and the price they actually pay. There's this, which is the value that we actually capture, we being this vocal firm, which is the difference between the price our customers pay and the cost of producing a good or service. And then there's this piece here, which is the difference between the cost we pay to our supplier and their next best alternative, or their opportunity cost. So all of this is value created, but just this piece in the middle is the value captured. And breaking it up like this helps us to understand a little bit, especially when we're talking about decisions of possibly acquiring a supplier, why we might do that, and who's actually capturing the value. But don't get lost in the weeds with this. Just remember that the framework here and the thing we're focused on is value creation. Does this combination create value or destroy value? And that's the question of synergy. So synergy from a long-term exchange results when three conditions are met. The assets required are highly specific to a transaction. The two parties transact frequently, and there's a fair amount of uncertainty. So if you could readily replace a supplier because there are many others in the market that produce a similar product or service, then you don't require specific assets, so you wouldn't meet that condition. If you don't transact often, like, you occasionally purchase a coffee, you don't need to go by the coffee shop or enter into a long-term subscription. You just go and transact on the spot market, and you'll be better off because you have more flexibility. And also, when there's great certainty, like what a good or service is worth, then again, much less need for a long-term exchange. However, and I'll give you the example of Disney and Pixar. You might be familiar with the two. Disney is the classic children's entertainment company that has an animation studio, but also theme parks and a bunch of other related experiences. And Pixar was a CGI-based upstart animation studio. The two worked together under a long-term contract where Disney promoted, distributed, and helped merchandise the films that were produced by Pixar, because Disney had all these complementary capabilities that Pixar did not have, where Pixar just had CGI animators working on movies. They didn't do all the distribution and all that marketing of their films in-house. So from that perspective, the assets required and the capabilities required from both parties were highly specific. Not just anyone can produce a CGI children's film, and not just anyone has the relationships, the network, the know-how of a Disney in order to market those films, get the merchandise in stores, promote the films, make them popular, have kind of other revenue streams like rides, etc. So both had highly specific assets. They both interacted frequently because Pixar was releasing multiple films a year. And so it wouldn't make sense for Disney and Pixar to renegotiate this promotional relationship every single time Pixar released a film. And then finally, uncertainty is high because you never know if a film is going to be a hit or not. So from both parties' interests, from both Disney's perspective and Pixar's perspective, having this long-term contractual obligation to one another was attractive because Disney didn't want to just negotiate for a single film and get stuck promoting a real clunker of a film. and then miss out on the opportunity to promote the next film, which ends up being a big blockbuster. Instead, they were in it to win it, and it helped align incentives for the two parties.